Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasul al-Kareem. Hello and welcome to another video in the Code Complete series. This video is going to be about Chapter 11, the power of naming variables. Actually, it is a very important issue as it helps massively in enhancing the readability of your code. Well, actually, Code Complete is one of a very few books who actually cared about it so much that it actually devoted an entire chapter to it. The concepts discussed here in this chapter doesn't only cover variable naming. It can also be extended to covering naming classes, packages, files, assemblies, whatever you name it. Okay, here are the points that we're going to be discussing. It's going to be discussed in this video. First, we are going to be talking about what should you take in consideration when you try to come up with a good variable name. Then we're going to address the issue of naming per data type. That means what naming mechanism should you follow for different data types. Then we're going to be talking about the point of all this. Why follow a naming convention? What benefit can you obtain from it? After that, we're going to discuss informal naming convention and prefixes, and why should we have a standard prefix. Then we'll discuss something that might seem challenging to you, but it's very important, which is coming with a short yet readable name. We told you what to follow. In this video, we're going to tell you what to follow, what kind of tips you have to follow in order to come up with a good name. But in this last section, we are going to tell you what not to follow, the kinds of names that you actually need to avoid. And as always, as all videos, we're going to wrap up. We're going to come up with some kind of checklist, stuff that you have to take care of when naming a variable. And then we're going to give you a small exercise just to make sure that you got it all right. All set? Let's go. Alright, so we're going to start by talking about the considerations in choosing good names. Well, when you have a child and you decide to name him or her, you can give him a name because it looks cute, or because it's the name of your father or your favorite athlete or whatever. It doesn't really matter much because the entity, the child, and the name are separated. But when you name a variable, they are not. In fact, a variable is good or bad as based on the name it has. That's why you need to be very careful about the naming. Well, I'll give you a very simple example. Let's say that I tell you that y equals x2 minus x1. Would you understand anything? What is y? What are x2 and x1? Of course, you don't understand because you have no information, no clue about what this is. So the readability of such code, this line of code, the readability is 0% because you have no idea what it is. But if I tell you that profit equals total income minus expenses, now it's very meaningful. So the readability of this code actually jumped to 100% because you now fully understand what it's all about. So this is the point of why do we need good names. Okay, the most important naming consideration, the most important naming advice that I can give you is this. I call it the golden rule. The golden rule is the name must fully and accurately describe the entity the variable represents. As simple as that. So if you want to come up with a good variable name for an entity, just write in as a sentence the words what the entity represents. So, for example, instead of naming a variable x, well, think about what it represents. Well, let's say it represents the number of runners in a marathon. So you can just name it number of runners in a marathon instead of just naming it x. Well, it's very easy. There is no confusion at all because there is no abbreviation, no ambiguous acronyms, no nothing. You just think about what this variable is supposed to represent and then just name the variable based on that understanding. So that's it. So I'm going to give you a small quiz here. I'm going to give you a problem, an entity, and you have to think about a good variable name to actually represent this entity. Well, the entity is, I would like you to represent the total number of IRS tax audits performed within the past 5 years. The total number of IRS tax audits performed within the past 5 years. You can pause the video, think of an answer, and then just move on. Okay, now we're going to talk about the optimum name length. Well, one might feel tempted for the past quiz just to name the variable total of number IRS audits performed within the past 5 years and just call it a day. That's a variable name. But the thing is, it is too long, and too long is not good. We actually we have already spoke about naming variables and giving too short names like x or n or r or temp, and we said that's a bad idea. But sometimes giving it a very long name is not a good idea either. Well, because, well, first of all, giving it a very long name is hard to type. You cannot type 90 or 100 characters just to represent an entity. It's too much. Plus, it's much of an eyesore. If you go through the code and you have a variable name that actually occupies almost half of the line, and you have like 10 or 20 of these, it's not a very good aesthetic thing. Your code doesn't look good at this. Plus, the whole point of readability is just if I take your code and give it to somebody else and ask them, they would be able to understand your code, and maybe they can work on it. But if you give me a code with variables of like 90 characters or something, anybody who's going through that simply is going to get bored. I mean, nobody has time to read 10 variables, each of them like 90 characters. It doesn't make sense. So you have to give it a reasonably long name. So it's not very short and it's not very long. It's, reasonable. Actually, there's some kind of a rule of thumb people use, is that usually variables should be within 10 to 16 characters. I don't know what the source of that, but most people use it. And well, 16 characters are reasonably long. It's not too short, it's not too long. So it's not a mandatory thing, but you can follow it if you like. So we're going to take a small example here. I mean, if we want to represent the event itself, or the entity itself, is the number of players in Barcelona Football Club. So one might say X. I just represent it with X, and that's it. Well, that's too short, of course, as we talked about, because if I see that, I won't know what X is. It might represent 100 things. One might say, I will give it a better name, a very good name. The variable name would be number of players in Barcelona Football Club, and that's it. Well, that's a very long name, as we illustrated. It's too long. Well, the better solution would be give it something in between, not too short, not too long. So a variable name like team players number, team players count, or team players total, it would be a good name. So it's not very long, it's not very short, and it's very informative. I can understand. If I see it, I would say, this variable represents the total number of the players, and that's it. Okay, we're going to talk about the effect of scope. Well, we've stated that short, meaningless variable names are bad. But the truth is, it's not in 100% of the cases. Sometimes, if the variable itself has a limited scope of operation, a short name like I or X or N is acceptable. By limited scope of operation, we mean that it isn't used outside a few lines of code. Just think of a loop counter. If you have a loop, like a for loop, and you have a counter that actually iterates the loop. If you give this counter is only going to be used within the loop body, right? Like 3, 4, 5 lines. So it doesn't really make much sense if you spend a lot of time thinking about a meaningful, useful name for it, because it's just going to be used within these few lines. So at this case, it might make sense just to give it a short name, and that's it, because it's going to be used within just a small scope. But of course, if you're going to use it within a larger scope, you have to give it a meaningful name. And the definition of small scope and larger scope is very subjective. I mean, one might say that 5 lines of code is a larger scope. One might say that 30 lines of code is a small scope. So there is no crisp boundaries here, but it comes to your experience and the size of the application itself. Actually, there was a study conducted by a W.J. Hansen in the 1990s, I think. And the point of the study was they wanted to understand the impact of the length of variables on the debugging time and also on the readability. So they did the debugging time experiments, which is easy, and then they gave the code to people to understand the readability of the code based on the length of variables. And the result of the study was simply, if you're using you're using a variable on a small scale, just a bunch of lines, it's better just to give it a short name. But if you're using it on a larger scale, just like we talked about, you better give it a more meaningful name. Well, some people are very defensive. Instead of just, even if it's going to be used within one line of code, they give it a meaningful name. They don't want to put any chance on somebody misunderstanding them. And, well, it might work. Okay, so we're going to talk about computed value qualifiers. What we mean by that? Well, sometimes, or many times actually, the variables you declare contain a computed value. That means the variable itself, or the entity the variable represents, is the result of a mathematical operation, like a sum, total, an average, maximum, minimum, median, stuff like that. So the tip here is that you take the qualifier itself, like total, sum, average, and put it at the end of the variable name. So for example, if you if you have a variable that represents the average grades, you better name it average grades average. If you have like a total employee number, you can name it employee total. So you take the variable name, the entity name, and then you put the qualifier at the end of it. Well, this is very useful because, well, a name like that, for example, take average grades average. The first part of the name, grades, tells you what this entity is. But instead of just naming it grades, and you won't be you want to understand, is it the total of the grades, is it the average, is it the median? But if you name it grades average, then you fully understand this represents the grades, the average of the grades. So it helps the readability, and it puts no place for ambiguity. Well, the second thing is that if you have a convention, it will help you. Let's say this. Let's take an example. Let's say that you're talking about the total of revenues. So if you don't follow a convention, you can just say, sometimes in code you can type or define or declare a variable and call it total revenue. Maybe in another code or another file, you declare a variable that represents the same entity and you name it revenue total, because you don't have a convention to follow. Maybe you just feel like it. The problem is, if somebody else reads this code or these codes, they won't understand. Do they both represent the same entity? Or maybe they represent different entities. Okay, if they represent the same entity, why does he give them different names? But if they represent the different entities, why it looks like similar, right? So the thing is, if you follow a convention, then you're going to be typing it exactly the same way all the times. So it very much helps the readability of your code. The only exception for this computed qualifier rule, the rule of putting the qualifier itself at the end of the variable name, is when we're talking about num. Many times when you actually have a variable that represents the number of something, people use num and put it at the beginning of the name. So if you have a variable that represents the number of students, you call it num of students and you put it at the beginning of the name. Well, this is totally acceptable, but you can just replace num. Instead of putting num of students, call it students total. Okay, it has the same meaning, so it doesn't really have much difference. That's it. Okay, now we're going to continue with naming specific types of data. We've talked about general considerations regarding variable names. Now we'll discuss special considerations related to naming any specific data type. Okay, we're going to start with naming loop indexes. Well, in almost every program you write, there is a loop. That's why naming loop indexes is a really big deal. Now we're going to take a small example just to illustrate what we're talking about here. Okay, we're first going to talk about a simple loop indexer. As you can see from the code right here, we have a very simple loop, and we go through items from the first item to the last item, and each of these items is processed with a method called process item. As you see right here, the loop index is used only in one line. The body, the scope of the loop itself is very limited, very small. So the indexer itself is just used within one line. So in this case, using I as a indexer, or as a variable name to represent the loop indexer, is totally legitimate. It's totally acceptable because it's just used within only one line. So it doesn't really matter if you give it just I or N or a short name. So in this particular case, using I as a indexer is totally legitimate. If we talk about another case, if we're talking about using a variable outside the boundaries of a loop, as you can see from here, we have record count, and then we go, if there are more records, more scores or more records, we go through a certain array, we process it, and then we process a certain item, and then we go to the next record. As you can see from here, the parameter record count is used within the scope, the body of the loop itself, the while loop, but it's also used outside the boundaries of the loop. As you can see from here, after the loop is finished, we go and call another method called submit record count, and then we use the record count parameter, and maybe we can use it in some other places. So as you can see here, if we give it another name, just instead of record count, we name it I or J or K, we cannot guarantee that this code, we actually know this parameter or this variable is going to be used outside the boundaries of outside the scope of the loop. So, well, if I see an I in everywhere, I'm not going to understand what this I is and what does it represent. So in this case, when the variable itself is used outside the boundaries of the loop, we have to give it a meaningful name. Just like here, instead of an I or an N or a C, we gave it a record count. Okay. Another case that we must use fully meaningful names is when we talk about nested loops. Well, a nested loop is complicated because if you give it an indexer, in this case, we have two loops. The first loop has an indexer called team index, and the inside loop has an indexer called event index. So let's say that if we use an I and J, just like most people do, and you give this one I and you give this one J, and then you go through and go with the code inside the body of the inner loop itself, you can easily get lost. I mean, you'll be thinking like, is I the outside loop or is it the inside loop? And then things are gonna get complicated. So the point is, if you're using a loop within a loop, if you're using a nested loop, it's better to give the indexer itself a meaningful name. So if within the body of the loop itself, you can totally understand if this indexer means the outside loop indexer or it's the inside loop indexer. Okay, regarding naming status variables. Actually, when people name status variables, they usually make the mistake of calling the variable itself, the status variable, they call it flag or status flag. And well, this is a mistake because when you read it, you cannot understand what this flag is flagging. What does it indicate? What kind of status it shows? So instead of that, you better use a meaningful name. We're going to take a small example here. We have a bad flag name. So as you can see, somebody's saying or typing if flag or if status flag, and you cannot understand what is flag, what is the status that this variable is supposed to indicate or reflect. You cannot understand it, right? So it's better to actually remove this whole flag thing altogether and give it a meaningful name to indicate a status rather. So as you can see from here, if data ready, then do stuff. It makes perfect sense right now. Alright, when naming Boolean variables, you have to keep something in mind. We have golden tips to follow when naming Boolean variables. First, you better keep typical Boolean names in mind. You have typical Boolean names such as done, error, found, and success. Well, as the name indicates itself, you can actually understand when it is used just by the name. For example, done is used when something is done, or an operation, or processing, or whatever is done. Then it makes sense you have a variable name that is called done that indicates actually the operation is done. And also for error, if something is error, if something is found, or a certain operation is successful. So it makes sense if you use these variables because the name itself is it can indicate well what does it represent. Okay, the second tip is that you have to give names that imply true or false for Boolean variables. If you have a Boolean variable such as success or done, well, it makes sense that this is a Boolean variable because you can understand if something is successful or not, is it done or not. But if you have a Boolean variable like file name, if file name, what does it mean? Yani, how can if file name? I wouldn't know if the body itself is supposed to be executed if this file name Boolean variable is true or false because the name itself doesn't indicate. But I can replace that instead of just saying if file name, we can say if file name available, right? Or if file available. So you have to give a name that actually implies either it's true or false. The third tip that it's really useful that you have to use positive variable names. And to show that, we're just going to give you a simple example. We have a code right here. If you read that, it's if not found. So this is kind of conundrum if somebody's thinking about it. How could it be not found? It's difficult. So instead of that, you can just name the variable found, right? If it's true, do this. If it's not true, do that. So you have, and the name itself, the name that is given to the Boolean variable should be positive, not negative. Alright, now we're going to discuss the issue of naming convention. Well, first of all, we have to kind of clarify what naming convention is. A naming convention is the standard or the style that you actually follow and that you have to follow. It's kind of a rule everybody working on a project must follow in naming variables. That's what we call a naming convention for a variable. Alright, we are going to be discussing two things. First of all, why do we need it? The benefits of having a naming convention, and then when do we need it? When you should have a naming convention. Well, first of all, when we're talking about the benefits of naming convention, there are many. We're just going to talk about three here. Well, the first thing is that instead of each and every time you have to name a variable, you have to think about giving it a name. What should the name be? What should the name be? And then you start thinking about it. Well, if you have a convention, you wouldn't need to think much, right? Because you already have a rule that you have to follow. So the benefit is that instead of each and every time going through your mind thinking about what should I name the variable, you can just use the convention. That's the first thing. The second benefit that if, well, let's say that somebody new is supposed to join the team, or the code that is supposed to go to somebody else for review or anything. If you have somebody who haven't worked on the code before, they have to read it. All right. Instead of learning that Ayman writes his code this way, and Ali names his variable the second way, and Muhammad names his variable a third way. Okay. And instead of all that, if we have a convention, that means there is a one standard single way of naming variables. So it's going to save him much trouble. Well, the third benefit is that it actually, when we use naming convention, it reduces what we call name proliferation. It's difficult. Well, simply what it means is that when different people are working on the same project and they're not using a naming convention, maybe they give the same entity different names, right? If we're not using a convention, if I work on, maybe I give an entity, for example, the average of grades. I give it grades average. Okay, somebody else, because we're not following a certain convention, maybe he thinks, well, it's better to call it just the average of grades. He gives it a different name. And somebody else reads this, he won't understand that, or maybe he won't even be able to link that these two variables actually represent the same entity. And this could be a real problem. So this is one of the biggest benefits of naming convention, is that we do not give a certain entity two or many different names. All right. The second point is that when you should have a naming convention, what are the occasions or the cases that it's better to have a naming convention? Well, the first case is that when multiple programmers are working on a project. Well, it makes sense because you don't want each and every one of them to come up with a different way of naming variables, and then you have a chaotic project. You need all the variables in the project to be named a certain way. So it makes sense that you need a naming convention in that case. Well, the second case is that when you plan to turn a program over to another programmer for modification and maintenance, which almost happens all the time, because as we talked before, if you give it to somebody else, then that certain somebody else, he has to understand how each and every one of the programmers name their variables, which might take a long time. If you have a standard, he doesn't need that. He just has to understand the standard, know it, the convention, and then he's set to go. Well, the third case is that when your programs are reviewed by other programmers in the organization, which is kind of the same thing. Eventually, you just have to handle your code to somebody else who hasn't been involved in it the first place, and they have to understand it. Well, another thing is that when the program will be long-lived enough that you might put it aside for a while and then go to it again. Because if you work on it and then stop working on it for, like, let's say 2 months, and then you come back to it, well, most probably you're gonna forget about it, or you're gonna forget many things about it. So you have to go through it again just to understand how does this thing work, how that works, and you will like to understand that the way things interact within the program. So if you give it some kind of a chaotic naming style, if you give each variable a name that just came to you without following any convention or standard, it might be difficult for you to actually to kind of remember how it works. But if you have a convention, also it's going to make it much easier. Of course, the book Code Complete itself is vendor neutral. It doesn't target a specific technology. So in the section of actual naming conventions, in a way of naming classes, naming objects, it actually takes all the languages in consideration, or most of them, like Java, C#, C++, or so. But in this video summary, we're focusing on C#. And this link actually from MSDN, it summarized everything that has to do with naming .NET entities, variables, classes, objects, exceptions, whatever. So you better check it out. Alright, now we'll consider the ultimate challenge. The challenge of coming up with a short yet meaningful name. Well, one might ask, why would I need to think about giving a meaningful short name? Why would I just give it a long name and that's it? Well, we have talked before about giving it a very long name. Maybe you don't need to give it a very long name, but you sure need to to know about the abbreviation techniques. If you have a long name and you'd like to make it shorter, how would you do that? What are the best ways to do this? So this is what these two slides are all about. It's all about eliminating needless words. Well, the first tip, or the first thing that you might apply to actually achieve that is to remove all non-leading vowels. Well, it makes sense because if you have something like, let's take, for example, if you have screen. If you type it like that, these are 6 characters. But if you type it like SCRN, it makes sense because it gives the same meaning. Everybody will read it, will understand that this SCRN is actually screen. And at the same time, you got rid of 2 characters. These 2 characters are vowels. So if you get rid of non-leading vowels, that the vowels, they're not at the beginning of the word, because if it's at the beginning of the word, it actually makes sense. If you remove it, nobody will understand. Same as for computer, for example. If you have computer, you can just type it like that, CPTR, right? Or if you have like pointer, people from since forever has been typing pointer, PNTR. It makes sense, you can understand it, and you got rid of excessive characters. So this is the first step. The second tip will be remove articles. By articles here we mean linguistic stuff that is used to link words together, stuff like and or the. Because, well, this is not a spelling bee competition. You don't need to add a and or in your variable name. Why would you need that? You just need to give it a concise name that would actually get people to know what that is without any excessive letters. So you have to get rid of those as well. Also, a third tip will be use the first letter or the first few letters of each word. This has been used to abbreviate words since forever. If you don't need to type the whole word, just give it the first 3 letters, sometimes just the first character, in order to indicate to people what the word is. For example, instead of typing administration, you can just type ADM, right? Almost everybody, in the context of what you're talking about, I mean, if I just came to somebody on the street and said ADM, he won't understand. But in the code, in the context of what you're talking about, the context of the code that you're typing, ADM, it might make perfect sense to indicate that. Alright, so this is the third tip. The third tip would be use the first letter or the first few letters of each word. Also, another tip would be keep the first and the last letters of each word. Just get rid of the what's between them. And this actually makes sense because, well, scientists have proven that if you actually have the first character and the last character of the word, then if you reshuffle the characters between them, people would still be able to understand it right. People will still be able to read it. That means the most important characters in the word are the first character and the last character. If you keep them, it might make sense even if you get rid of the characters between them. Also, we have a fifth tip. The tip says remove useless suffixes. Well, the point here is that we have suffixes like ing, right, or ed, or or, stuff like that. Linguistic suffixes. You don't need them, so you might get rid of them. But the key here is, as you can say, what we said is useless suffixes, because sometimes suffixes are important. I mean, if we're talking about events, for example, so stuff like ing and ed does make sense. If you have changing, that means execute the event while something is actually happening. I mean, at the time of this happening, execute what's supposed to happen according to it. But if you have it, for example, like change, that means after the event itself is done, then execute the code. So at this, for example, in this example, having a suffix like ing and ed does make sense. But in other cases, it might not make much sense. It might be just some kind of a linguistic thing, just to make it linguistically correct. We're not talking linguistics here. We're talking code. So if you don't need it, just get rid of it. The sixth way of creating a short name that is readable, of course, which is the most prominent way, the most used way, is just to abbreviate it. And abbreviation itself is not easy. We have like 3 tips for you to use when you actually do abbreviation. The first tip is that you have to abbreviate consistently. I mean, if your abbreviation mechanism is to take the first character of each word, just use it all the time. You don't need to, for example, for a word, if you have something like this. For example, World Health Organization. Well, if you use an abbreviation technique that takes the first character of each word, it would be the WHO. And that makes perfect sense. But if you come to another word, another term, for example, Food and Drug Association, and you say that, oh, I would say the first character of the word, and then the second character of the second word, and then the first character of the third word. It's not consistent here. You have to use the same mechanism. If you take the first character of each word, just take the first character of each word and do it to all of your sentences that you'd like to abbreviate. So you have to be consistent. Use the same rule on all the words. The second tip will be create names that you can pronounce. Well, it makes sense because, for example, if you'd like to indicate the X position in a screen, in your code, you'd like to have a variable to represent the X position. So if you type it like that, or if you abbreviate it like that, if X pos, you can pronounce it, right? Because X pos, that would be it. You can pronounce it easily. But if you replace it with X PSTN, if you'd like to represent the X position, so if you say X pos, you can just type it like that, pronounce it like that, X pos. It's easy to be pronounced. But XPSTN, you cannot. You have to spell the character XPSTN, right? So when you come up with an abbreviation, you have to think about: does it make it? Is it easy to pronounce? If it's easy to pronounce, that would be it. Otherwise, you have to think of another abbreviation that would be easier to pronounce. It'll just make your life easier. A third tip, which is very important, that you have to document the abbreviations. I mean, right now, if you type XPOS or you type WWE or you type whatever kind of abbreviation and you use in your code, maybe it makes total sense to you, but it may not make very much sense to somebody else who's reading this, or maybe to you if you forget about it and you'd be like, WWE, what does that represent? So it would be a very good idea if you have a file in your project just dedicated to document the abbreviations that you use and what each of them stand for. It will make much more sense. Alright, now we're going to talk about the kinds of names to avoid. Well, here are some guidelines regarding variable names to avoid. First, you should avoid misleading names or abbreviations. Well, that means you have to make sure that a name is unambiguous. For example, false is usually the opposite of true. So it doesn't really make much sense if you use it as a variable name to stand as an abbreviation for something else. For example, if you have an entity like, for example, fig and almond season. If you want to come up with a shortcut or an abbreviation for that, it would be FALS. But in everybody's mind, false is always related to true. So if you use it as an abbreviation, it doesn't make sense because it will be very ambiguous to people. You should avoid that. The second tip will be that you have to avoid names with similar meanings. That means if you can switch the names of two variables without hurting the program, you need to rename both variables. That means these two names, they represent different entities, but they have the same meaning as names. For example, it doesn't really make much sense if you have in your file you have two variables. One of them is named, for example, let's say num records. Alright, you have a variable called num records, and you have another variable in your file called record num. You have these two variables in your code. Alright, they have the same similar meaning, but they represent different entities. But as name-wise, as variable name-wise, they look alike. So you have to avoid these kind of names because it's very ambiguous. Because maybe people will, confuse them together. So you have to avoid names with similar meanings. Different entities should have different names with different meanings. Also, you should avoid names with different meanings but similar names. That means in your code, alright, you have entities with different meanings, no relation to whatsoever with each other, but they have the same name. Alright, so this is very ambiguous as well, because also you will confuse them with each other. You have to avoid that. Okay, a fourth tip would be that you have to avoid names that sound similar, such as in English language many letters are not pronounced. For example, if you have rap, you can write it like that, and you can write it like that. So if you put two variables but both of them are pronounced the same way, it will be ambiguous to people. Maybe in reading it won't be much of a problem, but if you talk to somebody and it will be discussing code and it will be like, the variable rep, and you won't know which variable is that, it won't help communicating your code. So you don't need to get yourself into this kind of dilemma. Just give variable names they do not pronounce alike. Just spell differently and pronounce differently. This is what you should avoid. Also, you have to avoid numerals in names. It's bad. You shouldn't be doing that. If the numerals in a name are really significant, It's different. For example, if you have to indicate the number itself, if you have to indicate it as a number, you can just write it in a letter. But it's a bad coding habit that you actually include names in the variable name. Also, it's a tip that you should really avoid misspelled words in names. It's hard enough actually to remember how words are supposed to be spelled. All right. To require people to remember correct misspelling is simply too much to ask, as I say. But it will be a problem also in readability, because if you misspell something, it might actually give a different meaning to somebody else who's reading it, right? And anyways, it kind of indicates improfessionality. So you have to spell words right in when you're giving names. It won't hurt. Alright, now we're going to wrap up. We're going to talk about all the concepts we've discussed in these videos just to make sure everything was concise and clear. The first thing we talked about was the general naming considerations. We have some bullet points, some key points we have to take care when we actually give a name to a variable. We have to make sure that the name fully and accurately describes what the variable represents. We also need to make sure that the variable or the name that was given to the variable refers to a real-world problem rather than a programming language solution. We also need to make sure that the name is long enough to be understood, to make sense, but not too long. Also, we have to make sure that if there is a computed value qualifier like a count or a sum or a total, it is actually appended to the end of the name of the variable, as we discussed before. Alright, we also talked about naming specific types of data, and also we have many points we have to take care of. We have to make sure that loop index names are meaningful if it is used in a greater scope, if the body of the loop itself is big, or there are nested loops. Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense to give it a long name. You can just give it a short variable like I or K or whatever, if the scope itself is limited. We have to take care that any variable that is used in a larger scope, the number of lines that use this variable are big, or the scope itself is big, we have to give it a meaningful name, right? That applies to anything. We also need to make sure that Boolean variables are named so that their meanings indicates that they are Boolean, indicates that it's either true or false operation. You cannot give a Boolean variable a name like file name, because what is file name? File name is not a true or false thing, right? You have to give it a name that indicates to somebody who's reading it, this is Boolean, this is either true or false. This is very important, you have to take care of. We also talked about the naming convention, and we talked about why naming convention is required, why do we need it, and we have to indicate that we have to make sure that the naming convention we follow distinguishes among different entities in a programming language. It's like a class, interface, object, variable, method. If you read something, you have to tell just by the name of it whether it's a class or a method or a variable or an object. You have to be able to do that. Your convention must allow you to do that. Okay, also we talked about giving meaningful short names. We have to make sure that the code that we use, or the abbreviation that we use, if we're using an abbreviation, we have to make sure that it uses the same standard to create an abbreviation from a sentence every time. If you take the first character of each word to make the abbreviation, then every time you should do that. Also, we need to make sure as possible that the abbreviations of the short names that we came up with, it is better to be pronounceable. It makes it much easier. And we also need to maintain some sort of a table or a document somehow to document all the short names or the abbreviations that we use. So if in like 3 years we came back to the code, of course we're not going to remember that this variable or this short name or this abbreviation was used to indicate that. We're going to forget it. So we have to keep it in one place, in a file, in the solution or something, just as a table, as a lookup for all the abbreviations. Finally, we discussed the types of names to avoid, and we had some kind of points we have to take care of, like, are the names misleading? Are the names different variable with similar names, or similar names with different meanings for different entities? We have to avoid that. Also, we need to make sure that different variable names should not sound the same, should not be pronounced the same way, just to avoid ambiguity. We also talked about using numerals in names, and we said that it better be avoided as much as possible. And we finally talked about we have to spell variables nice. If we have a variable name that actually represents a real word, not an abbreviation, not a shortcut, just a real word, we have to spell it right, just to as much as possible to remove any kind of ambiguity that might occur by misspelling it. So these are the checklists for these videos. You have to make sure that everything is right. Maybe you need to go through it again. If something doesn't ring a bell in these checklists, just go to the part of the video where we discussed it and listen to it again, and it will be obvious. The next part will just be an exercise. There is going to be an exercise here in the same folder where the video resides, and just try to give it your best shot just to make sure everything is right. And now this video is over. Next chapter, go through next chapters just to be more